25 years ago, on a cold November night in Texas, 58 young people climbed a tower of 2 million pounds of timber in the dark, and 12 of them never came back down. And this is the story of why they were there, what nobody chose to do to stop it, and why, after everything that happened, students in that same town are still building that fire today. College Station, Texas. You would not find it on a map unless you were specifically looking for it. It is a flat, wide stretch of the Brazos Valley about 90 miles northwest of Houston, surrounded by pine forest and open farmland, with a Union Pacific Railroad track cutting the university campus clean in half and separating the academic buildings on the east side from the sports facilities and agricultural land on the west. It is the kind of town that exists entirely because of the institution at its center, and the institution, Texas A&M, is not merely a place where people go to study. To the people who belong to it, it is closer to a religion than anything else they have ever found a name for. Texas A&M was founded in 1876 as the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, the first public university in the state, and for most of its early life, it was a military institution in every meaningful sense. All male until the 1960s, with compulsory Corps of Cadets membership until 1965, and a culture built around the conviction that conformity, loyalty, and shared hardship were the foundations of a life worth living. By the time the 1990s arrived, the university had grown into one of the largest in America, with more than 40,000 students, but the military spirit had never left. It had simply evolved into something harder to define and impossible to argue with. The Aggies are held together by rituals that outsiders consistently struggle to understand. The Yell leaders, elected by the student body, who lead chants at football games that are never called cheers. Muster, a ceremony observed every April 21st anywhere in the world that Aggies happen to find themselves, where the names of those who died that year are read aloud and someone answers here for each one, so that no Aggie is ever fully absent, and the Aggie ring, a heavy gold band that functions as a kind of passport between strangers, the symbol of having earned your place in something that mattered. And then there was bonfire. Aggies do not like using the word tradition to describe bonfire, because the word feels too small. It began in November of 1907 when a group of cadets, celebrating a football victory over Tulane University, gathered up campus trash and lit on fire. Not because anyone had planned it, but simply because they were proud and young and had nowhere else to put what they were feeling. Nobody organized it. It simply happened. And then they did it again the following year and the year after that. And each time it grew a little larger and a little more central to what it meant to be an Aggie. By the 1940s, students had replaced the pile with a teepee of vertical pine logs, hundreds of them, leaned together and wired at steep angles to build height and internal tension. By the 1960s, the teepee had given way to something far more ambitious, a multi-tiered structure that engineers, when they eventually came to examine it, would describe as a wedding cake, layer upon enormous layer of logs stacked into the Texas sky, growing more complex and more precarious with every passing decade. This fire was always lit the night before the most important game of the year, Texas A&M against the University of Texas. The rivalry between these two institutions runs deeper than football and older than most of the people in the stands, and bonfire was the most visceral way the Aggies had of declaring what they felt, that their burning desire to beat the hell out of TU was not a figure of speech, but a flame they were capable of building 6 stories into the air with their own hands. The University of Texas, 90 miles up the road in Austin, was everything they were not: urban, architecturally grand, and perpetually condescending toward the school in the small town with the railroad track running through it. Aggies had spent the better part of a century forging their identity, partly in defiance of that perception, and bonfire was the loudest possible declaration of who they were. By 1969, the structure had reached 109 feet into the Texas sky, setting a Guinness World Record for the tallest supported bonfire ever built anywhere on Earth. The university imposed a 55-foot height limit after that, citing fire hazard from sparks drifting too high in the November wind. But the cap was treated by the students who built bonfire as a challenge far more than a rule, and they pushed against it every single year. Now here is something essential to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. The entire operation was run by students alone. Not the university, not a construction company, not a team of licensed professionals, but young people between 17 and 22 who had never built anything like it before. The operation was led by a group of student leaders called the Red Pots, named for the color of their hard hats, who serve as architects, foremen, safety officers, and the final authority on the construction site all at once. Below them in a strict hierarchy came the brown pots, the yellow pots, the crew chiefs, and then thousands of general workers organized by dormitory unit, until at its peak roughly 8,000 students, a full quarter of the entire university population, participated every year. The process took 3 months. It began in late October with weeks of pre-dawn mornings in the pine forests outside College Station, where students felled trees one by one with hand axes, because every single log was cut by a human being. Then came load, hauling those logs onto flatbed trucks and bringing them to the site. Then stack, 3 weeks of building the structure tier by tier, wiring thousands of logs around a central pole spliced together from 2 shorter ones to reach the necessary height. And finally the push, the brutal all-night sprint when rotating shifts worked through the cold Texas dark to finish what months of labor had started. There were no blueprints, and there had never been blueprints, and every piece of knowledge about how to build this structure lived entirely in the memory of the Red Pots who had done it the year before, passed down in conversations and demonstrations from one class to the next across decades. The way a trade was once handed between a master and an apprentice before anyone thought to write any of it down. By 1999, the only written documentation for the construction of one of the largest student-built structures in the history of American universities was a rough schematic printed on the back of a commemorative T-shirt, and nobody at Texas A&M found this alarming, because this approach had a name and a philosophy behind it. They called it the other education, the belief that what students gained by organizing themselves and solving real problems without a manual was just as valuable as anything a professor could give them inside a classroom. It was a deeply held belief, and for almost a century, nobody could definitively prove it wrong. The first thing that needs to be understood about what happened in November 1999 is that it was not a surprise, not to everyone, not entirely, and not in a way the university could have honestly claimed never to have foreseen. A civil engineering professor at Texas A&M named Teddy Hirsch had been watching Bonfire with growing unease for years, because he had noticed something that once you saw it clearly was simply impossible to unsee. Every single bonfire built in the wedding cake style, the multi-tier design that became standard in the early 1980s, collapsed within roughly 45 minutes of being lit, every single time, without exception. Students had built a saying around this pattern. If bonfire stands past midnight, we will beat Texas the next day, and that saying existed precisely because it almost never did. The structure would ignite, the crowd of 30 to 70,000 people would roar, and within the hour the whole thing would begin to fall inward in a slow spiral, logs crashing toward the center while flames rose into the November air. When Hirsch examined the angles of the logs and performed calculations that nobody else had ever bothered to make, he saw a structure held together by a single spliced center pole and thousands of feet of thin baling wire, carrying forces that had never once been measured by anyone qualified to measure them. And he understood that those forces had not been engineered. They had simply been inherited and accepted. He raised his concerns within the civil engineering department and conveyed them to the university administrators responsible for oversight of student activities, and was received with a polite, non-committal acknowledgement that has always greeted experts who try to disrupt something that has been functioning for a very long time. Nothing changed. Then came the autumn of 1994. Weeks of heavy rain softened the ground beneath the partially completed structure until the center pole bent 90 degrees under the weight pressing down on it, and the whole stack began to lean visibly to one side. Student leaders cleared the area before anyone was hurt. 9 tractors and 2 bulldozers dismantled the structure in a single day. Students worked around the clock to rebuild it, and Bonfire burned, only hours before it was scheduled, as it had always burned. The investigation concluded that the cause was the rain and the soft soil, an environmental explanation for what was, in the view of every engineer who would later examine that moment, a structural failure that had simply been waiting for a trigger. The inquiry did not ask whether the design itself was the underlying problem, found its external cause, and moved on. When the investigators who came after the 1999 disaster overlaid the 2 collapses on top of each other and compared the patterns, they found them to be nearly identical. In the wake of 1994, steel cables were introduced to wrap around the outer tiers of the structure and contain the internal stresses building within the logs, a meaningful and direct response to what had almost happened. 2 tons of lime were also spread across the construction ground to harden the soil. For the 1999 build, those steel cables were quietly left out. The investigators who later tried to determine why could only confirm that they were absent, and nobody has ever fully explained the decision. The 1999 stack was also built 4 feet taller than the official height limit, a fact that both the Red Pots and the university administrators who received regular progress reports knew perfectly well, and that no one with the authority to halt the construction chose to act upon. And then there was one final thing the investigators pulled from the university's own records, something that had been sitting in the files all along. As far back as 1987, Texas A&M had arranged accidental death and dismemberment insurance policies for the students working on Bonfire, and by 1996 had taken out a $2 million general liability policy specifically tied to the event. The university would later argue in court that these policies had been purchased through an advisory committee rather than the institution itself. But somewhere inside the administration, someone had understood clearly enough that this structure could kill people to arrange financial protection against that outcome. And that same understanding had never been translated into any structural protection for the young people climbing the stack in the dark. By the 3rd week of November 1999, the bonfire stack was nearly complete, a tiered tower of 5,000 logs standing at 59 feet on the open ground at the northeast corner of campus, 4 feet above the height it was supposed to reach, exactly 1 week before it was scheduled to burn the night before Texas A&M faced the University of Texas in the final game of the season. The construction lights threw long shadows across the logs and the workers climbing between them as the midnight shift began on November 17th, and by all accounts it was a cold and ordinary night in College Station, the kind of push night that felt exactly like every other push night had felt. Music playing, students calling to one another. The energy high the way it always was in the final hours before the tradition that defined the whole semester reached its burning conclusion. Bill Davis, a crew chief from Aston Hall, made his way up to the second stack and greeted friends as he climbed, later describing it simply as a cold, cool night, with nothing in the air to suggest what the next few minutes held. Dominic Browse, a freshman in the Corps of Cadets, scrambled up as quickly as he could to secure a swing position near the top. Happy to be there, happy to be part of what this place did. Lucas Gregory, a sophomore, was working on the second tier about 20 feet off the ground, the logs solid and familiar beneath him. 58 students were on or around the structure when the sound reached them at 2:42 in the morning. One student described what she heard as the structure beginning to groan and creak like a door opening in a horror movie, low and slow and wrong in a way that took a fraction of a second too long to interpret. The lowest tier had been carrying internal stresses that no wire and no pole had the strength to contain indefinitely, because the logs of the upper stacks had been wedged aggressively downward into the lower ones during the final days of construction, concentrating enormous compressive force toward the base. While the uphill side of the structure had been overloaded because only one of the 2 cranes on site had been operational the previous night. The ground across the site dropped about 1 foot in elevation from west to east, a slope so slight that no person walking across it on any normal day would ever notice it, but one that became catastrophically relevant when 2 million pounds began to shift. The baling wire on the lower tier snapped, and when it did, there was nothing left to stop what followed, because when that weight starts moving, as the investigators later put it in their report, the wire ties snap as if they were made of string, and the center pole faces forces it was never designed to withstand. The structure came down in seconds toward the southeast, in the direction of the slope, and a student on the stack named Jenny Calloway would later reduce the entire event to 3 words. It just snapped. Some students were thrown clear and survived with broken bones. Others were buried where they stood, pinned in the spaces between the logs, unable to do anything but call out and wait and listen for the sound of someone coming. One of the students on the upper stack was Christopher Breen, a Texas A&M graduate from Austin who had called his parents earlier that same evening with news that had nothing to do with Bonfire. He and his roommate had enlisted in the Marines that afternoon, and he was proud of it, and he wanted them to know. When Christopher felt the structure shift beneath him and understood what was about to happen, his last act was to shout a warning downward to the students working below him. The Texas A&M Emergency Care Team, a student-run first response service that staffed every construction shift, was on the ground immediately, beginning triage and calling for every available medical resource on campus. College Station firefighters arrived within 4 minutes. Bryan Emergency Services responded. The university police and EMS deployed everything available. Within the hour, Texas Task Force 1, the state's elite urban search and rescue unit, had been activated and sent to a college campus, to a construction project with no professional oversight, to a field where teenagers and 21-year-olds had been building a 6-story tower of timber in the dark for 3 months. The rescue operation lasted more than 24 hours, because every log had to be moved in a carefully calculated sequence in consultation with structural engineers, since any wrong movement risked collapsing what remained of the pile onto the people still buried inside. The entire Texas the rescue operation lasted more than 24 hours because every decision about which log to move and in what sequence had to be made in consultation with structural engineers brought in from the university, since any wrong movement risked destabilizing what remained of the pile onto the people still buried somewhere inside it. The entire Texas A&M football team arrived and began removing logs by hand alongside the rescue crews. 50 news satellite trucks were broadcasting to the country before sunrise, and a reporter who drove 90 miles from Houston in the dark described stepping out of his car and immediately hearing men shouting for tools and calling each other's names. A sound he said was like a war zone. The M football team arrived and began removing logs by hand alongside rescue crews. 50 news satellite trucks were broadcasting before sunrise, and a reporter who drove 90 miles from Houston described stepping out of his car and immediately hearing men shouting for tools in the dark. A sound he said was like a war zone. One of the students buried deepest in the wreckage was Timothy Curley Jr., a mechanical engineering sophomore from Bartlett, Tennessee, an Eagle Scout and member of Corps Squadron 16 who had been on the stack that night with the same commitment that had brought thousands of others there before him. When rescue workers finally reached him, he was pinned by timber and in critical condition, and his first words to them were not about himself. He said, "Help my buddies first." He then directed the rescue team, one by one, to 5 other trapped students he could locate from where he lay, providing directions until each one had been found before he allowed anyone to work on freeing him. Timothy Curley Jr. became the last of the 12 to die from his injuries. He was 20 years old, and he was posthumously awarded the Boy Scout Medal of Merit for what he chose to do in the minutes after he was found. At 6 in the morning, the last survivor was pulled free. 12 were dead. 27 were injured. The 90th bonfire would never burn. The Special Commission on the 1999 Aggie Bonfire was assembled to answer the question that everyone on campus and eventually everyone in the country who followed the story was asking. How does a structure built by the same hands, with the same methods, in the same place, every single year for 9 decades, fall in the dark and kill 12 people? What the commission found was not the story of a single catastrophic failure, but the story of a long accumulation of decisions, assumptions, and silences that have been building inside this tradition for decades, until the only genuinely surprising thing about November 18, 1999, was that it had not happened sooner. Their technical conclusions were precise and unsparing. The 1999 structure had failed for 2 primary reasons. The logs of the second stack had been wedged aggressively downward into the first stack during the final days of construction, creating internal stresses far beyond what the wiring was designed to contain, and the containment strength of that wiring was fundamentally inadequate for the forces being placed on it. A problem that the steel cables wrapped around the outer tiers in previous years had existed precisely to address, and which were not present in 1999. The center pole, which under normal conditions served as the last line of structural defense, was overwhelmed within seconds of the lower tier beginning to fail. But the commission did not stop at the engineering because they understood that the engineering failure was only the final expression of something deeper. There were no blueprints because there had never been blueprints. There was no engineering oversight because the university had for 9 decades deferred to the principle of the other education and trusted the accumulated knowledge of students who had never been trained as engineers. The only written guide to constructing one of the most complex student-built structures in American history was the schematic on the back of a t-shirt. The 1994 partial collapse had been classified as a weather incident with no structural investigation and no design changes. The height limit had been exceeded by 4 feet with the full knowledge of both the student leadership and the university administrators, and nobody had intervened. The Texas Board of Professional Engineers reached their own conclusion. The Aggie Bonfire met the legal definition of a complex construction project under the laws of the state of Texas and was therefore required by law to have been designed and supervised by a licensed professional engineer. It never had been, not in 1999, not in 1969, when it broke the world record, not at any point in 92 years. 6 lawsuits were filed by the families of those who died and were injured, naming the university, its administrators, and a red pot from both the 1998 and 1999 builds. The families pointed to the accidental death insurance policies in place since 1987 and the $2 million liability policy from 1996, and argued with considerable force that an institution which had arranged financial protection against a catastrophe had clearly understood that a catastrophe was possible and had chosen to cover the financial risk rather than remove the structural one. The university maintained that those policies had been arranged through an advisory committee, a distinction the courts ultimately accepted. Federal Judge Samuel Kent dismissed the claims against individual officials in 2004. The Red Pots settled their portion in 2005 for roughly $4.25 million. The Fifth Circuit dismissed the remaining suits in 2007. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case. And in October of 2008, Texas A&M settled the final lawsuit for $2.1 million, with one formal commitment attached. If Bonfire ever returned to the official campus, it would require engineering oversight. In June of 2024, University President Mark Welsh III announced that Bonfire would not return. The decision, he said, was final. Before any of this became an investigation or a lawsuit or a national news story, there were 12 people who had come to a polo field in the Texas dark because they loved something and believed in it. And this is who they were. Miranda Denise Adams was 19 years old, a biomedical sciences sophomore from Santa Fe, Texas, who had written not long before that November about falling in love with Texas A&M the moment she first set foot on the campus, about how demanding the work was and how entirely worth it that difficulty would be when she finally earned the Aggie ring she was working toward. She never received it. Christopher David Breen was a Texas A&M graduate from Austin who returned every year to be part of the push because the bond of this tradition does not end at graduation. And on the afternoon of November 17th, he had called his parents with the proudest news he had to share. He and his roommate had enlisted in the Marines that day. A few hours later, when he felt the stack move beneath him, he spent the last seconds he had calling down to the students working below him. Timothy Doran Curley Jr. was a mechanical engineering sophomore from Bartlett, Tennessee, an Eagle Scout and member of Corps Squadron 16, whom his family described as someone who had never been content simply to exist, someone who spent every year he had trying to fill the time in front of him with something that would matter. He directed rescue workers to 5 other buried students before he allowed anyone to help free him. And his sister said, when the 12th death was announced and the total reached 12, that the number meant something different now than it ever had before because the 12-man tradition at Texas A&M, the promise that there's always someone ready to step in for a fallen teammate, had just been given a face, and his name was Tim. Christopher Lee Hurd was 18 years old, a pre-engineering freshman from Houston who had been at Texas A&M for barely 3 months, still in the very first weeks of the Aggie life he had worked to reach. Chad Anthony Powell was 19, a computer engineering sophomore from Keller who arrived at A&M as a National Merit finalist, his high school's valedictorian, and a full scholarship student, and who joined Bonfire because his father said it was Chad's way of finding his footing and earning the right to lead by proving he was willing to work. His parents' statement after his death was 4 words. He died giving himself. Nathan Scott West was a sophomore from Bel Air, a competitive swimmer and National Merit semifinalist who graduated 18th in his class and who had once, as a Boy Scout, spent his free time helping restore a neglected inner-city cemetery where a Civil War hero was buried. The kind of young man who noticed the things that needed doing and simply went and did them. Michael Stephen Ebanks was 19 years old from Carrollton and had earned his private pilot's license this summer before coming to Texas A&M, where he was studying aerospace, chasing the sky in every direction he could find. Brian Allen McLean, also 19, had captained his high school swim team in San Antonio for 4 years and carried into every room he entered a quality that everyone who knew him tried to describe and none of them quite managed, though most eventually settled on the same phrase. He never met a stranger. Jamie Lynn Hand was a freshman environmental design major from Henderson, Texas, and her clothes and her artwork and her photographs remained exactly where she had left them in her family's home for years after she was gone, each one too full of her presence to be moved. Lucas John Kimmel was a biomedical sciences freshman from Corpus Christi following a family tradition at Texas A&M, the school where both his father and his brother had studied before him, part an Aggie line that was supposed to continue. Jerry Don Self was 20 years old from Arlington, a junior in engineering technology who had played football, run track, and served on the student council in high school, and who a former teacher remembered simply as the kind of person you could always count on, the one who showed up, who stayed, who gave more than was ever formally asked. Jeremy Richard Frampton had come the farthest of any of them, traveling to College Station from Turlock, California, nearly 2,000 miles from home, because this was the place he had chosen, and this was the family he had decided to belong to. 12 people from 12 corners of the country, on the same field, on the same cold night, for the same reason, because being part of something that mattered was worth showing up for. And they were right about that. The 27 who survived have carried that night inside them ever since, each in their own way. Some came back to finish their degrees that spring. Some left Texas A&M and never returned. Erica Alcala, who was there that night, spoke at the 25th anniversary about a detail that stayed with her for all those years. The smell of black and mild cigars from a crane operator working the rescue site. So that even today, when that specific smell reaches her from somewhere unexpected, she is immediately and completely back on that field at 2:42 in the morning. And then there were the seniors across campus who had not been at the stack that night, who walked to the memorial site in the days following the collapse and quietly removed their Aggie rings. The rings they had spent 4 years working toward and earning, and left them at the base of the crosses because the 12 would never get to earn theirs and someone thought they ought to have them. There's a poem at Texas A&M called The Last Core Trip, written in 1951 by a student named Buddy Duval, and it imagines an Aggie arriving at the gates of heaven still in core formation, welcomed in with all the ceremony that the institution they gave their lives to would want them to receive. It is read every year at muster, the ceremony where the living answer for the dead, and in the weeks after November 18th, 1999, a woman named Catherine Holmes Smith sat down and wrote new verses to it because there were now 12 people who had not existed when the poem was first composed, but who belonged to it without question. On November 25th, the night the bonfire was supposed to have burned, 40,000 people gathered on the open ground with candles, stood for 2 hours of silence that nobody had to organize or enforce, and then walked together to Kyle Field, the football stadium that holds more than 100,000 people and was fuller that night with grief than it had ever been with anything else. In the stands, they relit their candles, and the Parsons Mounted Cavalry fired the Aggie cannon 12 times, once for each person who was no longer there to hear it, and the silence between each shot was the heaviest thing in that stadium. Former President George H.W. Bush was in the stands with his wife Barbara. Beside them sat his son George W., then the governor of Texas, and his wife Laura. Both of them, they're not as public figures, but simply as Aggies. The week before, something had happened at the University of Texas that neither school will ever fully forget. The students there, the rivals, the other side, the people the bonfire had been built to face down, darkened the lights on their famous tower, the one that normally burned orange on nights of celebration, and held a gathering in the plaza below it. They lit white candles. They called it a unity gathering and invited every Aggie who wanted to come. And the message arrived in College Station with a weight that no one there had been expecting from that particular direction. That grief is larger than rivalry, that some things matter far more than a football game, and that two schools 90 miles apart could find in each other's loss something more important than the competition between them. The game was played on November 26th. Texas A&M, ranked 24th in the country, faced the 7th-ranked Longhorns before 86,000 people in a stadium that had never felt quieter at kickoff. Before the first snap, a formation of F-16 jets flew over in the missing man formation, all of them piloted by former Texas A&M students, the gap where one aircraft should have been giving the absence of the 12 a shape in the sky. At halftime, the University of Texas Longhorn Band dedicated their entire performance to the fallen students, ending by playing Amazing Grace and then Taps. And when the final note faded, every member of the band removed their white hats at the same moment and walked off the field without a word. The Aggie students, who by deep tradition only sit when the opposing band is performing, stood for the entire performance and gave a standing ovation to a band from a school they had spent their lives learning to beat. Texas A&M won the game 20-16 on a fumble recovery in the final minute by a freshman linebacker named Brian Gamble. And when Gamble fell on the ball and looked up, he was already on his knees with his arms spread open and tears on his face. And the photograph of that moment became one of the defining images of everything that week had held. The university suspended Bonfire after the collapse and concluded after 2 years of internal debate that it would not come back. By 2002, students had formed a nonprofit and begun building their own bonfire 15 miles off campus, calling it Student Bonfire, and it still burns every November. The structure they build is nothing like what stood in 1999. It rises 32 feet from roughly 2,500 logs, anchored by a single utility pole sunk 15 feet into the earth, wrapped at every tier in aircraft-grade steel cable, with 4 additional poles bolted to the center, and every log required to touch the ground before the build is considered sound. Professional engineers oversee the design and construction. In more than 20 years and more than 20 burns, there has never been a major structural incident. The new red pots were the names of the 12 on their helmets, and every senior leader must memorize those names before being given any authority on the site. Every class studies the commissioner's report, the full documented account of exactly why the 1999 stack failed and which decisions and silences made it possible, not as a warning, but as a foundation, so that everyone who picks up an axe or climbs a tier knows what they are part of and what it cost. The Bonfire Memorial was dedicated on November 18, 2004, 5 years to the day, on the exact ground where the collapse occurred. The Tradition Plaza at the entrance honors the full weight of what Bonfire was across 9 decades. The History Walk is a line of 89 granite stones, one for each year Bonfire burned between 1909 and 1998, with amber light glowing within the notch cut into each stone after dark, so the entire walk appears to burn in the night air, with one deliberate gap for 1963, the year the fire was not lit out of respect for a murdered president. And then the Spirit Ring, a circle of 12 portals surrounding the exact place where the center pole once stood, each portal oriented to face the hometown of one of the 12, each carrying a portrait, a signature, and words written in their own voice or the voice of someone who loved them. Every year on November 18th, at 2:42 in the morning, students and alumni and the families of those who did not come home gather at the memorial in the Texas dark. They observe 12 minutes of silence, one for each, and then the names are read aloud. And after every name, the crowd answers here, the way Aggies have always answered for those who cannot answer for themselves. Miranda Adams, Christopher Breen, Michael E. Banks, Jeremy Frampton, Jamie Hand, Christopher Hurd, Timothy Curley Jr., Lucas Kimmel, Brian McLean, Chad Powell, Jerry Self, Nathan West. Here, there's a question at the center of this entire story that no investigation, no settlement, and no redesigned structure has ever fully resolved, and it is not a question about engineering alone, though it begins there. It is a question about how a community of intelligent and deeply caring people could watch a structure grow larger and more dangerous across 9 decades, receive clear warnings, observe a near-identical collapse in 1994, carry insurance against the very catastrophe they were not preventing, and still arrive at November of 1999 without changing anything that mattered. The honest answer, as best as anyone has been able to give it, is that some things become so deeply woven into who a community is that the community loses the ability to see them clearly. The tradition had become the identity, and the identity had been made untouchable by the love poured into it year after year, and by the time the right questions needed to be asked at a volume loud enough to force an answer, it was already too late for 12 people to hear them. What the Aggies chose to do with that truth is worth understanding. They did not abandon the fire, and they did not allow the names of the 12 to become merely historical. They rebuilt the tradition from the ground up with every lesson the catastrophe had given them fixed into its foundation. They put the names of the dead on their helmets and required themselves to understand in precise and permanent detail what had gone wrong and why. They turned a catastrophe into a discipline and a tradition into an act of remembrance. That is not redemption, because 12 people do not come back for any reason, and grief does not balance against safety protocols, and what was lost on that cold November morning in the Brazos Valley is not recoverable by anything built afterward. But it is the only thing that remained available, and every November, at 2:42 in the morning in the dark in College Station, Texas, The candles go up and the names go out into the night air, and the Aggies answer for the ones who cannot answer for themselves. And that is what they have, and they do it every single year without fail.